trash." The word echoed across the courtyard, sharp enough to slice through laughter. Phones tilted, cameras caught it, and whispers spread like wildfire. Aisha's heart pounded as eyes followed her every step, mocked, belittled, dismissed in seconds. What no one knew was that across the street, her father was minutes away from finalizing a $750 million empire-shaping deal. And in that single moment of cruelty, their jeers would ignite a decision powerful enough to shock the business world. This is the story of pride, principle, and collapse. Welcome, story lovers. Where are you watching from? Hit the like button and drop your city name in the comments so we can see how far our story travels. Isha Laurent had never been one to flaunt her name. Though her father's empire stretched across continents, tech, real estate, finance, she preferred quiet corners of life where his billions didn't define her. At university, she walked to classes like everyone else, carrying secondhand books, tying her hair into simple braids, and rarely speaking of home. To most, she was just another young woman trying to carve her way through life. That's exactly how she wanted it. But privilege, even when disguised, leaves traces. The watch on her wrist, her late mother's gift, wasn't common on a college student. The way professors greeted her with a bit of extra respect didn't go unnoticed. And then there was the color of her skin. It was the one thing Aisha couldn't hide, the marker that, to some, screamed what they thought she didn't belong to, the so-called elite. Still, her world felt stable. Mornings began with coffee in the bustling student cafe. Afternoons were spent in libraries where sunlight spilled across wooden tables, and evenings were spent on phone calls with her father, who never failed to ask, "Are they treating you right, Aisha?" She always answered yes. What she didn't admit was the sting behind certain glances. The whispered words when she walked past wealthier white students in her business program. "Scholarship kid," some said. "Out of place." She brushed it off, convincing herself it was harmless, but she couldn't shake the quiet unease that followed her. Because beneath the polished surface of her university life, something darker was building. She didn't know it yet, but a single moment of mockery, one loud, cutting insult delivered in public, was about to ripple far beyond her campus walls. And when it did, her father's $750 million deal, the crown jewel of his empire, would be placed on the line. It began like any ordinary morning. The campus quad buzzed with chatter as students rushed to classes. Aisha carried her books close to her chest, weaving her way through the crowd, her focus fixed on the business presentation scheduled for later that day. She was part of a small group tasked with pitching a mock corporate merger, ironically a case study about global investments worth billions of dollars. For Aisha, it was just another assignment, but she had prepared meticulously. What she didn't know was how that ordinary morning would become extraordinary, for all the wrong reasons. The whispers started as she approached the lecture hall. A pair of students leaned against the doorway, their voices low but sharp enough to pierce. "She thinks she belongs here because of who her daddy is," one sneered. "Doesn't matter how much money she has, still trash." The words hung in the air like poison, drawing chuckles from the small circle gathered around. Aisha froze. Her chest tightened. She had heard things before, subtle, veiled, disguised as jokes, but never this raw, this public. She wanted to vanish, but her name was already tossed into the crowd like a spark on dry leaves. A few phones lifted, recording. Someone muttered, "Send this to the group chat." She forced herself forward, pretending not to hear, but the laughter followed like footsteps. Inside the lecture hall, the sting remained. She kept her eyes on her notes, refusing to meet the gaze of those who had witnessed her humiliation. That afternoon, her father arrived on campus. Richard Laurent was not just a billionaire. He was a strategist known for turning fragile opportunities into empires. He was in town to finalize a $750 million partnership with a European conglomerate. The meeting was scheduled in a glass-walled boardroom just across the street from campus, and Aisha, still shaken, had planned to slip home quietly. But the moment she stepped out of the building, she saw them again, the same students who mocked her earlier. This time their audience was bigger. They stood in the open, their voices louder. "There she goes," one shouted, pointing directly at her. "Daddy's money can't buy class." Another added, "Some people just don't belong in places like this." The crowd laughed. Aisha's cheeks burned, her throat tightened, and she felt the weight of dozens of eyes. Every step forward was heavier than the last. She wanted to scream, but silence felt like her only shield. Her father's driver arrived at the curb just in time, ushering her into the car. Yet through the tinted glass, she could still see their sneering faces, their mocking gestures. What none of them realized was that their cruelty was about to collide with forces far larger than themselves. Across the street in that high-rise boardroom, Richard Laurent was moments away from sealing the biggest deal of his career. The European executives were already seated, reviewing final terms. Contracts worth hundreds of millions lay on polished oak. But just as Richard adjusted his tie and prepared to step in, he caught sight of his daughter, head bowed, shoulders trembling, as she slid into the car. He also noticed the jeering crowd and the pointed laughter aimed at her. For a man who had built his fortune on vision and detail, that moment was not a blur. It was crystal clear. He didn't see just students being cruel. He saw the ugly truth of how quickly people could turn, how easily racism and arrogance could strip dignity away, even from someone who bore his name, and suddenly, numbers on a page meant less than the tears his daughter tried to hide. Still, the European executives waited upstairs. Time ticked. Lawyers tapped their pens. This deal would change industries, shift markets, and secure generational wealth. But Richard Laurent was no longer thinking only as a billionaire. He was thinking as a father. And the decision he made in the next few minutes would shock everyone. The boardroom lights glared down on polished mahogany as Richard Laurent entered. The executives from Europe straightened in their seats, pens poised, documents aligned, eager for signatures that would lock in the $750 million merger. On paper, everything was perfect. Terms agreed, profits guaranteed, reputations fortified. Yet Richard's mind wasn't in that room. It was still outside, replaying the sight of his daughter humiliated, mocked in public, not for her intellect, not for her actions, but for the skin she lived in. As the lead negotiator slid the contract toward him, Richard's pen hovered. His advisors leaned forward, almost whispering with their eyes. "Sign. This is the deal of the decade." But the billionaire remained still. Seconds stretched into silence. The European chairman cleared his throat, sensing hesitation. "Is something wrong, Mr. Laurent?" Richard looked up, his jaw tight. For years he had taught Aisha that dignity and worth outweighed wealth. Yet here he was, about to shake hands with men who had recruited interns from the very university where his daughter had been demeaned. Men who, behind closed doors, had once joked about diversity hires as if people were check boxes, not lives. His pen clattered onto the table. "Gentlemen," he said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of finality, "this deal is off." Gasps rippled across the room. Advisors exchanged frantic glances. The European executives erupted in protest. "Off? We've spent months. This contract secures both our futures." Richard stood, buttoning his jacket with deliberate calm. "If my daughter can be mocked as trash by the very culture you nurture, then your partnership isn't worth a cent of my money. Consider this my final word." And with that, the $750 million deal collapsed, shattering not just financial projections, but the illusion that success meant silence in the face of injustice. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, headlines flashed across global networks. Laurent walks away from $750 million deal. Investors scrambled, analysts speculated, and critics questioned his sanity. But for Richard Laurent, the decision was not madness. It was principle. He refused to align his empire with those who treated dignity as disposable. At home, Aisha sat in silence, her laptop glowing with the breaking story. Her father entered the room, not with the stern look of a man who had just dismantled a fortune, but with the calm certainty of someone who knew his choice would echo far louder than profit margins. "You're worth more than their approval, Aisha," he told her. "And the world needs to see that." The mockers on campus didn't expect the consequences. Their cruel words, meant to belittle one young woman, had instead exposed a culture of arrogance that cost their sponsors billions. The university scrambled to issue statements, distancing itself from the incident, while students who once laughed fell into uneasy silence. For Aisha, the humiliation still stung, but it no longer defined her. The collapse of the deal transformed into something greater, a message that no amount of wealth or prestige could justify silence in the face of racism. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every student who had been whispered about, every professional passed over, every person told they didn't belong. And as the dust settled, one truth became undeniable. Sometimes walking away from power is the most powerful act of all. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more powerful stories and videos.